All right. Yeah. Welcome to Creekside Book by Book. And if you're watching on YouTube, thank you for joining us and following up with us. And we are going to be going through Genesis 37 through 41. And it is a lot of text. But part of the reason why I broke the text down this way is because it gives us a good bookend for the life of Joseph, like how he started as a young, brash, immature person who's been gifted by God and goes through some things to become a leader that God put in Egypt at just the right time to bless the nations. And as we are going through the book of Genesis, one of the things to remember is that God's covenant with Abraham was that through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And so this is one of the ways that we start to see that work out is through Joseph as one of the descendants of Abraham blessing the nations of the world. But it starts with Joseph as kind of a troublemaker in his family. So if you remember last week, Jacob and his family, they went down to Bethel and they Jacob is like officially changed his name to Israel, and we wrapped up the account of Esau's family and Jacob's family is starting, and so now here we are with Joseph. And so we are it might feel like I'm going through stuff pretty quickly as we go through the text, but I will have a lot of notes that I'll share in the email as well. So so let's just jump in. Genesis 37 verse 1. Here we go. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel, who is Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brother said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. All right, so if we remember that Joseph had, Jacob had 4 wives, basically: Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, and Bilhah. And these 4 women were in a baby war. Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife, and the first son of Rachel was Joseph. And so Joseph was Jacob's favorite child of his favorite wife, and so he is getting a lot of special privileges. One of the things we see right away in this text is Joseph was also a tattletale. He gave an evil report about his brothers. And we don't know what that evil report was. We just are told he gives an evil report as he's out with them shepherding, tending the flocks. And so this creates some tension between Joseph and his brothers, who are all pretty much older than him. And then we also see that his father favors him with, we'll see this in the next section though. He favors him with a coat, and the coat is one of those things that is a designation of his favored status. So there's all kinds of different things going on with Joseph. No, it wasn't verse 3. Yeah, he gave him, made an ornate robe for him. And so the coat of many colors is what they're referring to there. And so we look at ornate and we say many colors, but it could have, different jewels woven into it. There could be a lot of things going on to indicate that it was just a fancy robe for Joseph. Is that what you said, Sandy? Fancy?
Huh?
Did you say fancy? Somebody said.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Fancy.
So yeah,
I
so
didn't.
they're jealous of Joseph for all kinds of different reasons. He's a tattletale. He's getting special treatment, and then he has these dreams. And the first dream, he tells his brothers, "You guys are all going to bow down to me. These sheaves, they're you. You're going to bow down to me." We all know young people are brash, right? They might do things without thinking. And we know this because we at some point were all young people. And so we can read the story of Joseph and be like, oh yeah, I would have probably done something like that as well, because it's just in our nature. And so he shares his dream with his brothers, and they said, that's ridiculous. And they hate him even more. Then he has another dream, shares it with his brothers, and his mom and dad now are included in this dream, and they're also going to bow down to him. And so his dad is like, that's ridiculous. What are you doing? This is not good. Now, one of the things to note here is there are two dreams that Joseph has, and he's not wrong. What he's saying about his dreams is true, but the way that he is delivering this truth is not helpful. And so that's something to keep in mind. The dreams, though, as well, like later on in what we're going to look at tonight, Pharaoh is going to have two dreams. And this double dream is a theme in ancient literature that is highlighting significance and importance. And so that one of the reasons why we're going to look at so much of the text today is because it starts and ends with two stories with double dreams. All right. And so, yeah, so Joseph is just creating more and more animosity now in his family because he doesn't know how to rightly apply and tell the family members about his dream and dreams. And so he is kind of becoming proud. And one thing about the nature of God throughout scripture is he has a tendency to bring down the proud. And we'll see that as it continues to unfold here, jumping into verse 12, 37:12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, which, remember, they were up in Shechem before, which is farther north. It's not really the place where Israel's family were supposed to go, but there is good grazing up in that region. So they went up to graze the flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? They have moved on from here, the man said. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him in one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So Joseph came to his brothers. They stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern, sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. And when Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It's my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So this whole event is ill-conceived. There are many challenges and problems. First of all, the sons are far away, and where Joseph goes to look for them, they're not there, and he's just wandering around. And by the providence of God, somehow somebody found him wandering and knew enough about who Joseph's brothers were, where they would have gone, and so then he went there. And he's doing this because his dad sent him. Like, we don't get the sense that he really wanted to go, but he's doing it because his dad said so. So he's trying to honor his dad, but his brothers already hate him. And this ornate robe stood out. So at a distance, they could tell, hey, here he comes. there's that dreamer. And right away, they plot to kill him. And, having siblings, there are times where you get real upset with your brother or sister. And here, these 11, 10 probably, because Benjamin is probably too young to be out here, but these 10 brothers, like, let's solve our Joseph problem. And they throw him in the cistern, planning to kill him. It really is what they want to do. And these cisterns were just big hollowed out parts, like it could have been like carved out in a hillside, like to build a reservoir for water. And so rain would collect in there during the rainy season, and they would use that water then to bring water to flocks and that kind of stuff. And so this one happened to be empty, and so they threw him in there. And Reuben is like, "No, we should not kill him. That's a really bad idea." And so he's thinking through, like, let me get my brothers to like vent a little bit of their anger, but not kill him, and then I'll come back and set him free. It'll be totally fine. And so he leaves. And while the brothers are eating lunch, they see these Ishmaelites. Now, Ishmael is also a part of the family of Abraham, Abraham's first son. And so these are like distant relatives now at this point. And they are traders going down to Egypt, and selling slaves back then was a fairly common thing. In 20 shekels, there's research to show that was kind of the going rate in the ancient world, was 20 shekels for a slave. And so they are looking to profit off of Joseph. All the while, the motivation is to come back to say, there's no way that your dreams are going to come true. And so if they can't kill him, then they will disappear him so that his dreams can't come true. And Judah is the one who is really leading the charge here on this terrible plan. And he's trying to profit off of his brother's death while also covering up, or profit off his brother's disappearance and cover it up by convincing their father that he was dead. And it's all just bad. The levels of deception in this story get worse and worse and worse. even so far as dipping the robe, tearing the robe, dipping it in blood, all of these things to bring it to Jacob, Israel, and say, like, is this your son's robe? And they didn't tell him that an animal devoured it. Jacob
Yes, indeed.
made the claim. Jacob's the one who says an animal must have devoured it, and that's exactly what they wanted Jacob to claim, to believe, and so they are doing all of these things to deceive their father Jacob, who himself was a deceiver. And so these tendencies in this plan, or in this family, are playing themselves out again and again, and so it goes into grieving and mourning. And there are a couple different ways that mourning could be expressed. They tear their clothes as a way of just like showing like the brokenness in their heart, in their life, and what's going on. They would wear sackcloth, which is made out of camel hair, and it's just very uncomfortable. There's all kinds of different ways that people grieved in these ancient times, and Israel's claim here is that he is going to grieve until he joins his son in the grave. And so, if you are familiar with the story here, it's many years until Jacob is going to see Joseph again. And so, thinking through how he is carrying on and the grief that he is going through, that is something to be mindful of in the story. And he kind of fades away for a time here. And the story then creates a contrast. The narrator of Genesis, the one who compiled these stories, like, is very, very smart, because we're going to get more about Joseph in a minute. But before we go down the road with Joseph, he's going to create a contrast between Joseph and Judah. Now, remember, Judah's the one who's like, let's kill him. Let's sell him into slavery. Let's get rid of him. Let's profit off of him. And so let's find out what Judah's up to. And so I'm going to read chapter 38, and it's a long chapter, but I'm going to read the whole thing just so we get the whole narrative flow. All right. And then we'll explain it a little bit. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There, Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and made love to her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son named Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the child would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira, the Adullamite, went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that through Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you? She asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? She asked. He said, what pledge should I give you? Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the goat by his friend the Adullamite, in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her." Beside the men who lived there said, "There has not been any shrine prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her my son Shelah, and he did not sleep with her again." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back in his hand, his brother came out and said, "So this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. All right. Weird story. That is a bizarre story. And so as we look at all of the different elements, we see a fracturing of the family dynamic in the family of Jacob, right? So Joseph sold into slavery. Judah leaves his family and he goes out on his own. And he's making friends with this Adullamite, and maybe he was a bad influence. We don't super know all the things that are going on, but what we're told is he marries this woman who's outside of his tribe, and they have kids. Great. This sounds like okay, this is how families start. Okay. But his oldest son, gets married and is wicked, and we don't know why he was evil in the Lord's sight, wicked in the Lord's sight. We don't know what he did, but the Lord struck him down. And so part of the tradition back then, there was a thing called a levirate marriage, which is where if a son dies, he's married, and they did not conceive an heir for that son, then the brother would then sleep with his brother's wife so that the original brother will have an heir. It is a complicated system. And it was not something that was just in Israel. It was something that was a fairly common practice because the line of inheritance was really important. And so trying to preserve that, it was a key part of many of these ancient cultures. And so, so Onan is supposed to do this for his brother, but Onan is selfish, and he recognizes that whatever child Tamar has, if Onan impregnates her, that's Er's son, not Onan's son, technically. And so he makes it so he doesn't conceive. And it's not just a one-time thing. It's whenever he sleeps with her, he spills his semen on the ground, is what the text says. And again, this is a very bizarre story, but God sees this as wickedness and strikes Onan down as well. In the middle of all this is Tamar, who is just trying to be a normal person and have a family. And Judah is afraid to let his youngest son marry or sleep with Tamar. And so he delays it and delays it and delays it and says, "Go back to your father's house," which is where Tamar would have gone back to in this situation. Go back to your father's house, and when Shelah's old enough, then you can have a child by him. But he just denies that opportunity, and Tamar has had enough of it. And so after Judah's wife dies, then he mourns for an appropriate time and goes and after mourning, goes up to do his work. And when Tamar finds out about that, she devises a little plan to trick him. And the things that she does here, like she doesn't say, she takes off her clothes or morning clothes and puts on clothes that would have indicated that she's a prostitute. She does not say she's a prostitute, but Judah treats her like a prostitute and she goes along with it. And so they sleep together. He promises a goat. The signet ring and the staff and the cord, all of the things that Judah gives as a pledge to send the goat, those are like his signature. Those are his identification. And so like those are on record with Tamar. Like this is who I was with. And so she has no real interest in a goat. She wants a baby. And so like when they're done and Judah goes home and sends a goat, Tamar's long gone. And his whole goal here is just to hide the evidence, hide the story, deny, just pretend it doesn't happen. If she doesn't want the goat, no problem. Judah's like, I will make another signet ring, cord, staff. I will move on. But she's smarter than him. And so when she starts to show that she's pregnant, the people freak out. They're ready to execute her. And that is when Tamar plays her cards and say, hey, whoever got me pregnant is the person who owns these. Do you recognize these? And so this is a fairly dramatic moment here, a great reveal in the text. And in this moment, we also see that Judah becomes repentant. He recognizes his own corruption, like that Tamar was doing what needed to be done, but Judah was unwilling to do what needed to be done to honor heirs' inheritance line. And so, again, this is a very weird story, and I am very grateful that this is not a normal part of our world anymore, because it would be very weird all the time. But Tamar does have kids. She has twin boys, and it's one of those signs to us here that maybe God was giving her a gift to compensate for the years of the lack of children from two husbands who both died, and God is blessing her in this way. And then we also see that Perez, like the birth order gets kind of confusing, because one puts their hand first and the scarlet thread is tied, and then comes back in, and it's all just like so bizarre, right? But it is it's through the line of Judah, through Tamar, that we lead to the line of David, through which we also come to Jesus and his earthly family. And so this story is very bizarre, a lot of messed up things that are so foreign to our culture, but it's also through this line that God does his greatest redemptive work. And I think that's important for us to remember, is we read stories like this and we see great dysfunction, but we can also see great redemption in these kinds of stories. And I would encourage us, when we read scripture like this, to come back and recognize that there's this great turnaround that God can do, but also remembering like the greater narrative of just what's happening in Genesis is God is creating these contrasts, because we have a sexual temptation and a sexual failure happening in Judah's life that God can redeem. And then we're going to see the contrast to Joseph. And so we're going to jump into Joseph's story here in chapter 39, verse 1. And again, I'm going to just read the whole story in chapter 39 so we get the big picture of what's happening, and then explain a little bit. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So remember, through Abraham's covenant, through your descendants, all nations will be blessed. So here is a descendant of Abraham who is blessing somebody from another nation in Egypt. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice, and Joseph said, and said to Joseph, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day, he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story: "The Hebrew slave you brought has brought us come to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. All right, we have a continuing theme here with Joseph. The Lord was with him and gave him success in whatever he did. So he's sold into slavery, and he becomes, pardon me, sorry. He's sold into slavery, and he becomes like the most trusted servant in Potiphar's house, who is the captain of the guard. Now, as captain of the guard, he may also have been the person who was overseeing the prison. And that will become important in a moment. But as he is building his influence in Potiphar's house, there's nothing Potiphar has to worry about at all. He is respected, and things are blessing, and like Potiphar's house is expanding, and his wealth is growing, and it's all wins for Potiphar. And so Joseph just wants to honor God and honor Potiphar. But his wife is a temptress and is trying to take advantage of Joseph. And so she tempts him over and over again. And he keeps saying no. And eventually she takes the cloak. This is the second time a cloak has become a problem for Joseph, because his brothers envied him because of the cloak. And then here, Potiphar's wife takes the cloak and uses it as evidence against him, even though Joseph is innocent. And so he's thrown in prison, and even in prison, he becomes a well-respected prisoner, basically leading the prison. And the captain of the guard, the warden of the prison, could be Potiphar, could be somebody else, but could be Potiphar. So it's one of those things where it's like Potiphar put him in prison, but he still is like, "You're a really trustworthy person, even in prison, and you're gonna continue to have great influence." Now he could have killed him. He could have executed him. And so we see this contrast between Joseph and Judah, and the Judah could have killed Tamar, but God spared her life through her scheming and planning. And here Joseph could have been killed, but God spared his life through his righteousness and diligence and good work. And so there's this important contrast here between these two major players in the book of Genesis. And we see God is with Joseph. All right. So let's look at this next passage here in verse 40, verse 1, and we'll read through 23. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with these two officials, the chief bearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confirmed. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night. Again, double dreams, two dreams, same night. And each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." And so the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put them in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." It's a little different dream. Now, the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. So this cupbearer, this is an important role. And on Sunday, we've been talking about Nehemiah, and Nehemiah also was a cupbearer to the king. And part of the role for the cupbearer is to test the food and taste it and to make sure that nobody was poisoning the king. And so this is a very trusted position. And somehow the cupbearer and the baker had offended Pharaoh. And there could be a thought in Pharaoh's mind that somebody is trying to kill him, trying to poison him. And these are the 2 people who could most likely be the culprits. And so he throws them in prison. And their dreams reveal to them, are God's way of revealing to them the plans and the timing of Pharaoh. So Joseph, who previously, last time he tried to interpret dreams, used this gift to interpret dreams to try to lift himself up. But here he's using this gift to try to bring clarity to people and help them understand what is going to happen. And for the cupbearer, it is good news. And all Joseph asks is, remember me. I'm innocent. I'm not supposed to be here. And even though he is like the chief prisoner in this prison, he might be pretty comfortable. He is still in prison and he would like to get out of prison. And so he's asking the cupbearer to remember me when Pharaoh restores you. And so then now it's a waiting game to see just what's going to happen. 3 days. The baker, same kind of dream. In 3 days, Pharaoh's going to do something to you. And instead of lifting up your head in a good way, he's going to lift up your head and then keep lifting it right off your body. And birds of the air will eat your flesh. So, I mean, you're in prison with these guys and they're probably not super happy to be in prison. And then one of them is like, I'm going to die. You just told me I'm going to die. But again, you have to wait the 3 days to see, is this actually going to happen? And on Pharaoh's birthday, it's exactly what happens. And Joseph is trying to be faithful, trying to serve and to help people. He's doing the best he can with what he's got, where he's at. And again and again, he gets snubbed because the cupbearer forgot him. So, chapter 41 tells us the rest of the story. And we'll read 1 through 40. So it's a long one. And so, so follow along with me. When 2 full years had passed, 2 full years after telling the cupbearer what was going to happen, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the river bank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up all the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dream, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. And now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled." So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." It's a key thing here that Joseph is turning this gift to the Lord here. Like, I can't do it. God will do it. It's important when we think about gifting and how we use the gifts that God has given to us. It is God working through us for his purposes. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "In my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile. When the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. And I've never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. Then the lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. Even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none of them could explain it to me." Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same." It's the double dream. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in two forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land and take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials, so Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all of this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So 2 years go by, and Joseph is waiting for the cupbearer to remember him. And Pharaoh has a double dream. Or so Joseph has two dreams, the cupbearer and the baker, two dreams, and now Pharaoh has two dreams. And so this double dream theme is happening throughout this section of scripture, and it really is showing this journey of transformation for Joseph. And so when the Pharaoh tells the dreams to the people, that the magicians, the wise men, the magi of his day, they can't figure it out. And so God stirs something in the cupbearer, and he's like, "Oh yeah, there's a guy I know, the guy who told me what you were going to do, and let me get him." And so they get Joseph out of prison. And one of the customs of the Egyptian people is to be clean shaven, and so they would shave their head, their beard, whereas the Hebrew people were not, and so they would have beards and stuff. And so Joseph, in order to be associated with Pharaoh, to even come into his presence, needed to shave his beard and shave his head. And this is one of the ways that we start to see Joseph become a little assimilated to the culture, if he's going to be associated with Pharaoh. And he tells him exactly what's going to happen. And after he interprets the dream, as God helps him to do that, Joseph then also gives him the plan on what to do, to appoint somebody who's a good administrator, and to have them start saving a fifth of the harvest every year. And where did Joseph learn to be a good administrator, to come up with a plan like this? Well, serving in Potiphar's house and overseeing all of Potiphar's affairs, and then also overseeing all of the administration of the prison of which he was a prisoner. And so he has all of these years of experience and training, and so he's ready to tell the Pharaoh, like, this is what I think you should do, and now go find somebody to do that. Joseph is not assuming that he is the person to do that. Something is changing and transforming in Joseph. When we met him at the very beginning of tonight's passage, he was like, "All y'all are going to bow down to me." And here he's like handing over ambition and saying to the Pharaoh, this is what I think you should do. Go find somebody to do that." And Pharaoh immediately just is like, "You're right. You should do this, Joseph. You should do it." And he's then elevated again to second place in the whole empire. So we have Joseph, who is the favored son of Jacob, the one who is set really to inherit the most from Jacob's estate. And he is proud and puffed up. His brothers sell him into slavery. And so then he is a slave in Egypt, and he becomes more and more influential in the house, knocked down a peg, prison, more and more influential in the prison, stranded there for 2 years. And now here he is, ready to move. And there's an urgency in the message. Like, this is going to happen like right now. The reason God told you this in 2 dreams is because he wants you to understand the urgency of what's about to happen. And Pharaoh believes and is able to put it all into motion. He's back, like every time he gets more authority, more authority, more authority. But to get there, he had to go through hardship. And it's the hardship that changed him and prepared him all along the way for the next level of authority. So let's keep going. Verse 41, and we'll finish out through this chapter. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He made him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. So here we see again Pharaoh, the father of Egypt, giving Joseph another robe. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift a hand or foot in all Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. And his Egyptian name here, like there's some debate on what it could mean. But one of the most likely understandings of his name is the one who knows things. So Joseph, the one who knows things. And so Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled through Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. The land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. By Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, Joseph named his first Manasseh and said, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim, and he said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried out to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. All the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. So Joseph now is elevated to the position of second place in what at this moment is probably the most powerful empire in the world. And he is the one through whom all of the administration of this rescue work is going to happen. And everybody listens to him. And we see he also marries a priestess in the Egyptian cult, their worship system. And he's assimilating more and more into the Egyptian culture. And, possibly just because he doesn't have any other option. There's nothing to tell him not to do this. But there's a key here in what's in his heart is as he is growing and like his influence is growing. He has 2 kids and he gives them very Hebrew names. And it's tying back to what God is doing for him. And so Manasseh is essentially like, I forgot my troubles. The Lord has helped me forget my troubles. And Ephraim is because God made me fruitful. So even though he's in a foreign land and he is becoming part of the culture of Egypt and administrating this country, he's still holding on to the Lord in some way. And remember, they don't have the Old Testament. They don't have the law of God. All they have are the stories that Jacob told his kids about Isaac, and that Isaac told Jacob about Abraham, and on down the line. That's all Joseph really has, is the story. And so he's holding on to the story of God, even as it is being told. And he might not realize what kind of role he has in God's story, but he is faithful to the Lord, even as the forces of Egypt are assimilating him. And all of the world is coming now to Egypt as the famine is spreading. And Egypt, it has the Nile River. And so there's this strip of the Nile River in this desert of Egypt that would have been very fertile. And so for a famine to come and wipe that area out, like, that's a big deal. That's a major famine. But just north of Egypt is the land of Canaan, which is where Joseph's family is from. And so all the nations are looking to who has something to help us. And so they start making their way to Egypt, going all the way back to Abraham and the covenant that God made with him. Then all nations will be blessed through you, through your descendants, Abraham. And here we see it's starting to take root. Joseph is placed through all of the struggle, all of the hardship. He's placed in Egypt for this moment to help keep the family of Abraham alive. And we're going to learn more about that next week. So, a lot of text we went over. Any thoughts, questions? Anything that maybe you're like, that was very confusing. What is that all about? Let me know. What do we got?
What was the famine just to what was the reason for the famine?
The text doesn't really say.
Did it say anything?
No, it doesn't say exactly what caused the famine. But in Scripture, we see God sends famine against the people of Israel when they are rebellious. But that is
Right.
not tied to Egypt here in any
Right.
way.
There was no rebellion. There was nothing. So I was wondering if it was just to fulfill the whole Joseph feeding the nation, or Abraham descendant feeding the nation.
Yeah. Well, I do wonder if that is part of what the Lord's intention here is, to show the people of Egypt the power of God. That God, like, Egypt is doing great, and even though it's going to be great for 7 years, watch out, because 7 bad years are coming. And so it's one of those things where when we get to Exodus, the plagues against Exodus is not because Egypt was outside of covenant, because Egypt was not a part of God's covenant. The plagues against the Egyptians were because God wanted to display his power. And so I do kind of wonder if that is a similar thing that's going on here, is God is displaying his power to Pharaoh through Joseph to then elevate Joseph to a place to save Pharaoh. So yeah, there's no specific reason that God gives for the famine other than it's coming, get ready. So yeah. Any other thoughts, questions?
Going back to the beginning,
Okay.
Rachel, why was she so important? Or I shouldn't say important, but his favorite wife, other than loved her first.
That's why he went to work for Laban, because he loved Rachel. He was taken with Rachel. And so right away.
Did he really love the boy as much or more than the others? Because they were later in life. It's like having the last kid and you kind of favor him.
Yeah, partly it's.
And you regret it later. No.
No, it was the most clear explanation for why Jacob favored Joseph is because he was Rachel's oldest son.
Gracious.
And that's that is not unusual in ancient culture with when there is polygamy involved, to have a favorite wife, and that favorite wife's oldest son would be the heir. Like that is entirely in Jacob's prerogative to do that. And his other sons, like if you remember last week, Reuben had Simeon, Levi, and Reuben. They had all done things to upset Jacob in a different way.
Yeah.
Simeon, Levi, they killed the whole town of near Shechem, and then Reuben slept with his concubine. So there's all kinds of messed up stuff happening. And then Judah is the next in line, and Judah is trying to save Joseph's life. But then we also see Judah has his own problems in chapter 38. Like he's got his own struggles that he's dealing with. And so, yeah, so Joseph is his favorite son, but he also is kind of by default like the most respectable son at this point. So. Any other thoughts, questions? We went over a lot of stuff, so.
It's been interesting to read. I really enjoyed this Bible study.
What about the robe? Joseph keeps getting a new robe.
Yeah. I wonder if he declines all the others.
Yeah, like after, like if his wife Potipharah brings him a robe, it's like, no thanks, I'm good. I don't need any more robes. Yeah, I do think there's an interesting thing going on there. Like the writer of Genesis is giving us these little like handholds to help us like climb the mountain of this story. And so the double dreams serve as like handholds, like pay attention. These are patterns that are happening. God is doing something here. The robes, sometimes I wonder if, like thinking about the three different robes involved in this story, like if they are like in storytelling, like there's a thing called the rule of threes where and especially joke telling, you set up a pattern. So the third thing in the pattern is usually the punchline. So like the classic, like a priest, a rabbi, and a minister walk into a bar, right? Like that setup. So the priest says this, the rabbi says this, the minister says this, and the minister is the joke. Like the third one is the actual punchline of the joke. And so I wonder if there is a rule of threes happening here, where God is, or the writer of Genesis, as he's telling this story, is helping us to see like this robe was a problem, this robe was a problem, this robe was the payoff. The Pharaoh's robe was the payoff for Joseph's whole life. So it's not a joke per se, but it's a setup payoff. So I don't know, like nobody in any of my research said that, but it's just something that I noticed and I thought it was interesting. So
yeah.
But that was, my dissertation was on humor and comedy, and so I see those kinds of patterns, and I see those patterns everywhere now, so I can't help it.
Well, maybe he was learning his wisdom. I know I can remember myself as I became a Christian, started learning things, and I learned more. And every time I learned something else happened a little bit greater. And finally, I'm telling God that I don't want to learn anymore. Just let me keep going around the mountain with the same problem.
Yeah.
And I meant it because I started going through them.
Yeah. As soon as we start telling God, I don't want to learn anything else, I think we might set ourselves up for some more frustration. But yeah, I do think, God was preparing Joseph and placing him exactly where God needed him to be. And we'll see that when he encounters his brothers later on. He's going to say, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And I find that to be like the greatest part of this whole book of Genesis is like a setup for that moment. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. And when we then read that through the rest of Scripture, we see Scripture through that lens. What God is able to do through the evil and the brokenness of the world. If we submit ourselves to him and surrender to him, like he can change those into beautiful and redemptive stories. And even Jesus on the cross, what the religious leaders meant for evil, God turned for good. And so that's the ongoing pattern throughout Scripture. This is what God is up to. He's rescuing us. Even when we see evil all around, God can still do wonderful, good things. So getting my preaching on.
So we see that going on in our country right now.
Yeah, God can redeem all the brokenness that we see all around us. So, yeah.
I'm anxious to see.
Yes, we all are. I think we're all ready for a new day.
I not like it at first.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
yeah,
good.
Well, next week we will continue on through 46. I think is how I divided it up, and then so we have 2 more weeks in Genesis, and then we'll jump into Exodus. And Exodus is going to be fun. In the beginning, there's a lot of action, a lot of really exciting stuff, and then there's a lot of laws, and so that's part of it. We'll get through it together. So
yeah, it's good.
All right. Well, y'all have a good night, and I will see you,
and you too.
Next week.